My parents kicked me out of their house the night they saw my bank app. They didn't stage a conversation or give me an ultimatum. They opened my phone, scrolled through the balance while I sat on the couch, and then my mother, calm, expressionless, got up, took my keys from the bowl by the door and told me to get out. My father stood in the kitchen doorway and counted aloud, as if reciting nails in a ledger. No rent for 6 months, no job for 3, credit cards maxed. We can't keep supporting you. Then they locked the door behind me. That is who did it, my mother and my father. And what they did was turn the only place I'd ever called home into an address I was no longer allowed to use. Why it hurt me is simple and stubborn. In their eyes, I stopped being a daughter and became a problem. I didn't just lose a roof. I lost the assumption that my life was worth steady kindness. That loss looked like a suitcase at the bottom of the stairs and my name being spoken only in cautionary tones at the dinner table. I was 24. My bank balance read $312.37. My student loan statements, crumpled in the junk drawer, added up to a number that made my stomach go cold. $28,450. I had a 2008 Corolla with a check engine light that blinked on like a warning, a part-time bar job that paid in inconsistent shifts and tips, and a degree that had promised competence and delivered a hard, slow climb. We lived in a split-level house on Maple Street, a block from a strip of fast food and a laundromat that still had the old change machines. My parents, Linda and David, had bought that house 27 years earlier. The mortgage was under their names. The porch light had been left on for me when I came home late from college, and my childhood bedroom still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets my grandmother had given my mother when I was small. Dependency isn't only financial. It was also being on their health insurance, using their address for bank mail, borrowing their car sometimes, leaning on them for references when I applied to jobs. Every one of those things put them in a position of leverage. So when I couldn't pay rent, because they started charging me $600 a month at the age of 24 for a room that had once been free, the imbalance became explicit. They said they weren't asking for a favor. They were running a household and I had to contribute. When I couldn't, they called it freeloading. The language changed from family to ledger. Their tone didn't have to be loud. It was the small surgical phrases. We did our part. You need to learn responsibility. We can't enable you. I tried to argue. I showed them the job listings I was applying for. I showed them the spreadsheet I'd made of shifts, income, and bills. I explained the interview I had next week, a real one, with a nonprofit for program coordination. But the spreadsheet didn't stop their hands from taking my keys. My mother's face was set like someone making a decision about a plant that wasn't worth watering anymore. After I left, I slept that night on a friend's futon and went to my interview with exhausted eyes. I got the job, part-time nights that would pay more than the coffee shop, but the house was closed to me. I moved my boxes into a storage unit the size of a one-car garage and kept a duffel in the back seat of my Corolla. The logistics of not being able to sleep in my childhood room became its own architecture of small humiliations. I ate at diners at odd hours. I showered at the gym. I worked the late shift and did day classes. At first, I told myself this was a temporary fire. I'd show them I had plans. I would get a full-time position. I would pay them back. I would be worthy again. The thing people don't tell you about plans is that they exist in stages, like stair treads, and sometimes one is missing. You can climb your way to the landing and still fall. The first escalation was slow but precise. My parents began to rewrite the story of why they'd locked me out. At neighborhood gatherings and at family functions, they offered a sanitized version. She needed to learn to stand on her own, they said, as if the phrase excused the act. Their friends nodded. My sister, 2 years younger, married and living in a town an hour away, kept quiet, which felt like betrayal because silence carries weight. My father's tone at Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving after I moved my things into storage, was a kind of academic cruelty. We gave you a chance, he told relatives. People choose comfort or work. She chose comfort. Nobody asked me to stand and dispute the claim in front of my aunt's casserole. That public recasting of events did something quietly terrible. It made me the author of my own damnation in the eyes of the family. The consequence was social exile. The situation got worse because I lost small supports that are hard to measure. An invitation to a birthday, a text asking for help moving, a sudden absence of empathy. Isolation stiffened into a pattern. The second betrayal came when they started to use money in ways that felt intentionally punitive. They stopped letting me use the family car to get to interviews. They stopped accepting my mail at their address. Letters began to pile up at the storage unit, utility bills, acceptance letters for workshops I couldn't afford, notices from the bank about an account I had closed. One week, I discovered an envelope with the title, Final Notice, stamped in red. I called, terrified, and the collector on the phone told me I had a balance overdue that would go to collections in 30 days. I called my mother and asked for help. She said she didn't have it and that she couldn't afford to give me money that I would waste. The word wasted felt like a hand striking across my back. My reaction was to work more. I picked up another shift and started a morning cleaning job at a small medical office and learned to get by on 4 hours of sleep. I walked between the laundromat and the bus stop, sometimes carrying a bag of clothes in plastic. I told myself that if my parents could be strict, I could be relentless. The third escalation was humiliation. My father came by the storage unit one afternoon and without knocking, opened the door. He stood inside among my boxes and said, quietly but with a smile, "You left these here. Do you want us to take them to Goodwill?" He had found a baby shoebox of letters from girlfriends, a stack of notebooks, a chipped ceramic bowl my grandmother had given me. His hand hovered over the bowl like a judge weighing evidence. I sat in the car and called the number on the storage contract. They said he had the key. I felt trapped in 2 timelines at once. The one where I had somewhere to go and the one where every bit of my past was being sifted. I asked for a meeting with my parents. They agreed on condition that I leave the car at the curb. I walked up their driveway carrying a letter I'd typed, an honest ledger of my income and spending, the classes I was taking, the job prospects, and they sat at the kitchen table and read it. My mother folded the paper and put it in her purse. "You can do better," she just said. My father put his hand over his heart and said he believed in discipline. When I left, my keys remained under the bowl. Each time something happened, I reacted, and the reaction produced new consequences. I learned to document the consequences. I took photos, I saved voicemails, I sent emails that recorded attempts at contact. It was tiny evidence against a narrative they were building that I was irresponsible. By the end of the first year, a neighbor had begun to bring me casseroles when they saw me on the street. A woman named Rosa, who ran the dry cleaners, slipped me spare change and told me not to mention it to anyone. The generosity felt like contraband. It also felt like oxygen. The fourth wave of escalation arrived with a legal edge. My parents told my sister that they were adjusting the terms of their will. The family solicitor, an unremarkable man in a small office on Main Street with a scented waiting room, sent letters. My sister called and read me an excerpt. My parents planned to allocate assets differently, they wrote, to reflect changed circumstances and to preserve family interests. The line that stung was specific and plain. Those who contribute will be prioritized. I thought of the house on Maple Street, the equity paid over decades, the way a house can be a currency in private. The consequence was clear. They were reassigning future value away from me in advance of my recovery. The situation worsened because the move was formal, documented, and presented as fiscal prudence. I couldn't prove malice. There were ways to argue that my parents had the right to do what they wanted. There is always a legal scaffold around hurt, but legality doesn't wash the cold from a bedroom that will no longer be yours. Years don't pass as smoothly as a montage. They're granular, made up of tiny sharpenings. I remember the winter my Corolla's transmission went and the way I sat on a bench in the auto shop office and watched men argue over replacement parts. I remember a job loss. The bar that had been my lifeline lost its liquor license after a late-night fight. I remember nights sitting at the bus stop with a paper cup of coffee and making lists of everything I could sell. My watchful ledger, my spreadsheet, turned into a toolbox of contingency plans. The low point arrived quietly, like the end of a long sickness. It wasn't one single brutal event. It was a confluence. A broken car, a landlord who raised rent on the sublet room I'd managed to keep, a medical bill that arrived because I couldn't afford the gym membership I used for showers. It accumulated into a moment when I had $12 in my wallet and a voicemail from the storage unit company telling me they'd auction off the unit in 30 days. I sat in the library and the weight of all of it settled into my limbs. I felt trapped, not only by the lack of money, but by a perception that the people who were supposed to be my safety net had decided I wasn't worth saving. I could feel the leverage I once had, small kindnesses, familial identity, sliding through my fingers. I had no power in their house, no voice at the solicitor's meeting, no authority as a grown person in the family ledger. I had been reduced to the unpleasant arithmetic of deficiency. It was a quiet, heavy moment. I cried in the library bathroom, washed my face, and did not tell anyone. What changed everything was small enough to slip into a file folder and mundane enough that it could have been lost, a cover sheet on a work assignment. By then, 5 years had not passed. They would, but not yet. In the third year after being kicked out, I had taken a job at a mid-sized financial services firm called Northbridge Advisory. It wasn't glamorous. It was a firm that did restructuring work for banks and small companies. I was hired for my tenacity more than for my resume. Someone at an interview had liked that I could speak plainly and had once gotten a non-profit grant to keep a community centre open for a month. At Northbridge, I learned how to read cash flow statements until the numbers looked like braille on my eyes, how to advise on payroll, how to model revenues under stress. I took a night class in corporate accounting and stayed on the extra hours to make up for what I didn't yet know. One Wednesday morning, the inbox pinged with a file marked Special Assets Client Maple Hardware LLC. My stomach did a small, unfamiliar motion. Maple Hardware was the name of the hardware store my parents had opened. My father had hung nails and paint swatches on pegboard for 20 years. It was a small business with a big place in our family story. When I opened the file, a single document sat at the top: Notice of Loan Default. The document was a simple thing. The bank had declared Maple Hardware in default on a line of credit. It listed dates, missed payments, and a clause that allowed the lender to appoint a special asset manager. That clause is standard legal language in banking circles, but here it read like an invitation. The loan had been underwritten 3 years earlier, and when the bank had underwritten it, my parents had personally guaranteed the loan. That meant the bank could, in the event of default, call for a restructuring and seek management changes. It meant the lender could exercise the right to install oversight. I didn't tell anyone I had family connected to the file. I wasn't sure what I could do. But I read everything a person can read when they've been taught to find leverage in paperwork. There were board minutes attached. There was a personal statement signed by my father, typed in a shaky font and initialed. There was a supply contract showing reliance on a vendor that had raised prices. So there was a line item in the financials: owner's drawer, Linda Dawson, $1,200 per month. That line had my mother's name on it. The numbers said the store was bleeding, not spectacularly, but enough. The turning point was a clerk's mistake. Someone at Northbridge had misfiled the engagement paperwork under local turnaround candidates without the usual firewall notice that would have flagged conflict. The file landed on my desk. My manager, who liked to test his junior analysts, asked me to produce a quick assessment because I had local knowledge, he'd said vaguely. I could have recused myself, handed the file up the chain, let someone without blood handle it. I didn't. I read, I calculated, I prepared a 1-page memo: risks, short-term cash needs, and an operations checklist. I offered an approach line that said a short-term stabilization might require direct oversight and interim operations leadership if the lender wanted to protect its exposure. The document didn't speak of personal revenge. It was clinical. It described leverage in terms of revenue and payroll cycles. It listed practical fixes, inventory controls, a simplified pricing strategy, a vendor renegotiation. It also, more quietly, outlined a role that required someone with patience, knowledge of the place, and an ability to withstand hard conversations with owners. Nothing in that description excluded my parents, but the practical language made an ethical wall. I sent the memo to my manager and marked it for escalation. The mistake, the misfile, created an opening. The bank's asset manager called for a meeting and asked Northbridge to place someone on site to assess immediate needs. My manager asked me to join the on-site visit. Because of your familiarity with the market, he said. They didn't know familiarity meant the hardware belonged to the people who had kicked me out. Sitting in the back of a fluorescent-lit conference room at Maple Hardware, I watched my mother sign her initials on a document that would bring a representative into their operations. She did not look up when the asset manager introduced me as Northbridge Associate. She saw me eventually, and her face went through a quick private conversion. Surprise, then an attempt at equanimity. Of course, she said, we're open to outside input. The betrayal was no longer just locked doors and private wills. It now involved official bank documents, signed, stamped, and procedural. There is no grandeur in such appointments. The bank wanted to preserve collateral, not to mete out poetic justice. When Northbridge proposed placing someone as interim operations lead to help them stabilise the store until a repayment plan could be agreed, the contract language described responsibilities: oversee inventory, manage payroll, report weekly to the bank. The bank had the right, my parents had guaranteed the loan, and default gave the lender the leverage to push management changes. The legal document the bank sent asked the owners to cooperate with reasonable requests. That phrase is cold and administrative, but it carries the force of law. I took the job. If this sounds neat, daughter becomes boss by virtue of paperwork, that's because the reality is procedural and often boring. There was paperwork, signatures, and late-night phone calls. There was a clause about conflict of interest and an internal review. There were people at Northbridge who asked whether I'd be comfortable, and people at the bank who went through checklists. The moral questions sat in the margins. What I did for the first week was what any competent manager would do. I worked. I counted inventory with fluorescent markers. I audited receipts. I sat at the counter in a twofold anonymity, daughter and consultant, and greeted customers while I watched my parents' hands move in old rhythms that knew where screws fitted into boxes. My parents were unprepared to be supervised by someone they had thrown out. My mother, who had reconciled herself to being the owner, now had to take instruction on scheduling from me. My father, who had always been the person who knew how things worked, had to fill out daily sales reports and enter counts into a spreadsheet he had previously mocked as fancy nonsense. The first week was awkward in ways that didn't catch fire but burned slowly. My father put up a small resistance. He called a vendor without checking with me and gave a price concession that made my margin model lurch. I had to sit down with him and explain plainly that we had to reconcile costs. He resisted, citing habit. I pointed to the numbers. I will not pretend my assent was vengeance. It wasn't a takeover filled with gloating. I was earnest and professional. I was also human in ways I did not prepare for. When the register bottomed out one Tuesday and I looked at the ledger, the debt was real, and so was my obligation to staff who relied on the store for wages. The bank's priority was the same as mine: stabilize the asset. That alignment made the business decision clear. There were days I dredged paperwork and fielded customer complaints while my father watched me and said nothing. That silence could have been 1,000 things: hurt, pride, recognition of me as competent in a way he had never acknowledged. Consequences unfolded in mundane increments. I implemented a strict inventory control that meant my mother could no longer draw out cash without documenting it. I negotiated with a vendor to delay a shipment so we wouldn't carry excess stock we couldn't pay for. I asked my parents to take a salary rather than an owner draw, which preserved cash flow. That last point was surgical. Their owner draws had been a steady, unquestioned line on the month-end wrap. Asking them to accept a salary reduced immediate outflows and placed them on payroll rules. They had to submit timesheets, request vacation, and follow standard HR procedures. For people who had been unfettered owners, it felt like a demotion in dignity. There was humiliation. There was also quiet, practical relief. The bank warmed to the idea because an unimpaired operation increased the possibility of repayment. The staff 2 longtime employees breathed easier when the shelves were organized and the schedule predictable. Customers began to say good-naturedly, "Things look different." A few regulars asked if the new manager was related to the owners and told me in a tone that was half sympathy and half admiration that I had done well to step in. What shifted for me wasn't that I was now in charge. It was that I had leverage that had nothing to do with family sentiment. The legal framework, the loan default, the bank's right to oversee, gave me formal authority. My role was literal, contractual. Power in this case did not require moral triumph. It required competence and routine. When owners are confronted with the real arithmetic of operations, the conversation moves from accusation to logistics. My mother learned to reconcile the cash drawer. My father learned Excel basics. The stakes were not hurt feelings alone. Payroll and credit were on the line. There were difficult conversations. My mother accused me in one of them of trying to take everything. "You knew how to do this all along," she said, voice small. "Why didn't you tell us?" I had no satisfying answer. I had tried to tell them. They'd taken it as weakness. Now the sequence of events had rearranged the power. I explained as plainly as I could that I had no wish to take what wasn't mine, but I did have an obligation to the people who worked here and a responsibility to the bank. I said I wanted to keep the store in the family because it mattered to the community. She listened. She did not forgive on the spot. Some things require time. The consequences were not theatrical punishments. I did not cut them off or exact reparations. I cut inefficiency. And I changed how the owners were compensated. I enforced paperwork. The store survived the first year of my oversight. The bank amended the repayment plan to something realistic because numbers showed a path. My parents grudgingly complied because their signatures mattered and because the alternative was losing the business. Over time, the dynamics softened in small, practical ways. My father began to ask about vendor accounts without defensiveness. My mother started to keep a neat ledger on the clipboard by the register, and sometimes, when no customers were in earshot, she would show me a coupon she had clipped and ask if we could feature that brand. They did not apologize in the way I had imagined, in the quiet bitterness of the early years. Apology, when it comes, is small and rare and often takes shape as a willingness to be present. The power imbalance shifted. I held formal authority. They held a history I did not own but could steward. There were costs. My promotion to interim operations led, and later, after a year of stabilization, to a permanent director role for the region, meant we had to formalize reporting lines. I had to be stern with them sometimes, to fire an employee who had been a cousin, to reduce margins by eliminating eccentric discounts, to insist on inventory controls that affected the little perquisites owners had once enjoyed. Those actions were realistic and non-spectacular. They were strategic, not vindictive. It is important to state what didn't happen. I did not become cruel. I did not seek to bankrupt my parents. I did not extract revenge. I was occasionally bitter. The bitterness mostly fueled my focus. I slept less, thought more about margins, and learned negotiation like a second language. I could have taken the easiest revenge, reassigned them to menial tasks, to spectacularly embarrass them. I didn't because the bank wouldn't allow that, and because the people who worked at the store deserved stability. Actions mattered more than explanations. A year into the engagement, I sat with my parents in the back office after closing. The lights were dimming. My father, calloused hands, the faint smell of sawdust that comes from years in hardware stores, handed me a paper cup of coffee. "You did good," he said. "It wasn't an apology, it was an acknowledgement." I said nothing for a moment because answers had to be measured. "We were hard on you," my mother said. She met my eyes. The words were simple and elliptical, not sweeping. They did not attempt to explain their earlier behavior, they just existed. That quiet was enough. The payoff was ordinary. The store stabilized, our payroll was reliable, vendors extended terms. The bank removed some restrictions after 6 months and then again after a year. The house on Maple Street remained in their name. We had not reallocated wills. There was no cinematic reversal of fortune where I walked into their kitchen and metamorphosed their characters. What happened instead was the practical rebalancing of responsibilities. I had authority, they retained ownership. We negotiated a new way of being together that involved spreadsheets and a weekly operations meeting, and sometimes a dinner where the conversation was like negotiating contracts, workmanlike but not hostile. There were consequences I had not predicted. Being their boss meant they now had to see me at my most competent. My childhood image, messy hair, the girl who forgot to pay a phone bill, had to be replaced with someone who knew how to forecast. That change in how they saw me was its own fragile healing. It did not undo the nights I slept in my car or the memory of the keys on the kitchen bowl, but it made future interactions less volatile. We did not become a happy family in the sitcom sense. The old wounds were still there, like a scar that tightens in cold weather. My sister and I did not become best friends overnight. Our détente came in small exchanges, a birthday card, a brunch where her husband paid for brunch without comment, that the solicitor's letters about the will were quietly shelved after a meeting where a family accountant explained how such moves could create tax consequences and relational complications. Nothing dramatic, everything incremental. In the end, what felt like victory wasn't revenge. It was work. It was proof that the choice to make a life in small, steady increments can create leverage that even a locked door cannot permanently deny. My parents had used money and domestic authority to cast me out. I used knowledge, stamina, and legal process to re-enter on terms that require them to conform to professional standards. Power was less a theatrical flip than an administrative reconfiguration. I still carry residual bruises. Trust is measured in footnotes now. I am cautious about leaning too heavily on their sympathy. I know how quickly a household can remove the porch light, but I'm also honest that there are softer things that matter now. The way my mother learned to make the daily deposit and text me a photograph when she did it. The way my father, when no one else was around, asked if I needed anything for the office. Those are small, human concessions. If you're listening and the line of your life curves against someone who once turned you away, I won't give you a tidy moral. I will tell you what I know. Leverage can be found in ordinary structures, contracts, payroll systems, a job that teaches you the language of money. People who hurt you are still people. Sometimes the way to change the dynamics is not to punish them dramatically, but to create systems that require them to behave differently. That outcome is quieter and, for me, more durable. It's been 5 years since they locked that door. I'm still the person who pays my bills on time. I still keep a notebook of long-term goals. I still get nervous when the bank calls. But when I walk into the back office now, I am the one who sets an agenda. They are on the payroll and they report to me. There is a strange gravity to that fact, firm, procedural, and oddly ordinary. If anything in this story resonates with you, leave a like. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe. And if you've been in a similar situation, tell me, what did you do next?